The truth is that humans are not broken. We are simply trying to live against the way the brain was created to operate. That thought appeared in me one morning when a soft gray light covered the wooden floor. I remember the dust floating like a quiet memory, and in that moment, while the cold still clung to my skin, I suddenly thought about all the times I had blamed myself for failing to do the simplest thing. Waking up and starting the day exactly as I had promised myself the night before. There was something sad and vague, as if invisible hands were pulling me back to the bed, making every effort feel heavy like walking through cold water. I once thought it was weakness, a sign that I was less than those who walked into the gym at 6 in the morning with clear eyes as if they were born with a kind of fuel I did not have. But the older I grew, the more I listened to the sounds inside, the more I realized there was another layer of logic, deep and ancient like the soil beneath the forest, guiding us more powerfully than any self-blame or any plan written with a blue marker. Sometimes, when I sit in the quiet kitchen in the early morning, holding a warm cup of coffee, I picture my brain as an old creature that survived thousands of winters, always alert to cold, hunger, wild animals, things I have never seen. It still follows the rules of the ancient world where energy was gold, where resting meant safety, where every unnecessary movement could lead to death. The world today is no longer like that. But that ancient part does not know it. It cannot tell the difference between the gym and the deep forest, or between an unfinished article and danger hiding behind the bushes. It only senses energy draining from the body, and in an instant, it chooses the path it knows best. Stop, retreat, seek the quickest and most comfortable feeling. I do not think I am the only one who feels this quiet struggle inside. Every time the alarm rings, the brain sends a soft invitation like a breath on the neck. Stay a little longer, just a moment, and we slip into procrastination the same way we sink into the sofa at the end of the day, not because we are lazy, but because our inner structure is still running on its primal programming. We do not see that. We only see ourselves losing, feeling weak, feeling pulled toward easy and cheap distractions like endless short videos or unimportant messages that still attract attention like a magnet. When I understood this, I began to observe myself as if watching a character in a different story. I noticed the small movements, the subtle hesitations, the thin moments when I wanted to do the right thing but turned toward what felt easy. Everything happened before awareness appeared, as if the brain had already chosen and I was only informed afterward. There were mornings when I sat by the window, watching the first light fall on the rooftop across the street, feeling clearly the two forces inside me, one wanting to move toward goals still out of reach, the other wanting to hold me in what is familiar, warm, safe, even when it brings nothing but stagnation. This opposition is not loud. It is like the soft footsteps of someone walking through an old hallway, not startling but still making you turn your head. It lives quietly in every small decision we make, whether we open the laptop or the phone, whether we stand up or lie down a bit more, whether we read a page or search for quick entertainment. Every small choice is weighed by a strange inner measure we do not know we carry. What is easy? What is fast? What threatens our sense of safety the least? That is when we realize a difficult but liberating truth. Lack of discipline is not weakness. It is simply the natural result of a brain trying to keep us alive the way it was taught millions of years ago. I remember once walking through the neighborhood on a winter evening, my breath turning into a thin cloud in front of me, and the streetlights glowing on closed windows. In that stillness, I saw that everyone carries their own private battle in their mind. The man riding a bike, the woman with a bag of fresh vegetables, the teenager staring into a phone, each one carrying a small version of the struggle I was living. Part of them wants to change, to move forward, to live a deeper life. Another part wants to keep them in what is familiar, where no risk exists, where energy is not burned too fast. The truth that this is shared, not personal, made me feel both relieved and tender. We always blame ourselves for things that our natural instincts quietly orchestrate. When I returned home that night, I turned on a small warm lamp, sat down, and realized that maybe it was time to ask a different question. If the brain was not created to serve distant goals, why do we insist on forcing it to change with rigid willpower? Why do we choose to fight our own natural design instead of finding ways to move with it, guiding it along paths with less resistance? That thought came softly like a breeze slipping through a door crack, but it lingered so long that I sat still. listening to my own breathing. Maybe the problem is not in us, but in the way we shape the world around us, in the way we speak to the ancient emotions living in our mind. Maybe all our past failures do not prove we are incapable. They only show that we have not yet learned the language the brain uses to guide behavior. From that moment, a steady idea began to grow in me like a small seed left between the paving stones. Maybe discipline is not the path of force, but the path of subtlety. Placing each stone in the right place, understanding ourselves so deeply that we do not have to push, we only have to guide. And when we understand that, we will see that the struggle that once drained us is actually the first invitation to look back at our entire inner world and begin writing a different story. When I began paying closer attention to the quiet movements in my life, I realized the world around me had never been innocent. The objects resting in the living room, the old wooden table with a long scratch like a forgotten memory, the stack of books placed unevenly on the shelf because one day my hand set them down in a rush, all of them quietly shaped the direction of my morning. There were days when I felt strong, ready to change. But the moment I opened my eyes and saw the workout shoes stuffed at the end of the bed, the running shirt lying somewhere in the unwashed laundry, and the phone glowing with a meaningless notification beside my pillow, I was pulled back into the old version of myself. The ease of wrong choices always stayed close enough to reach, while the right ones hid in the shadows as if the world itself wanted to test me a little more. Once, while rearranging the kitchen cabinet one afternoon, I noticed that the teacup I often used was placed on the lowest shelf, where I only needed to bend slightly to reach it, while the healthier things were kept high above, too far from my eyes, as if life was quietly ranking what I was meant to touch. The discovery was so simple it felt almost funny. Yet it opened a door in me that could not be closed again. I was not weak. I was simply living in a room arranged for me to fail. Every old habit was supported by the objects around me, while the things I dreamed about had no clear place to stand. A person cannot endlessly choose difficulty when ease is always within reach. Our brain follows its oldest rule: choose the path that costs the least. And the room I lived in was full of such paths. That evening, I walked slowly through the hallway and saw my shadow stretching across the wall. Blurred like an unfinished thought, I realized I had placed too much hope in willpower. The thing everyone talks about is a bright torch that can guide us through any darkness. But willpower is only a flickering candle in the wind, while the environment, the quiet and persistent presence around us, is the wind that decides whether the flame survives or fades. A chair that is too soft, a remote placed in the perfect spot, a habit of unlocking the phone the moment we lie down. These are sweet invitations the brain has no reason to refuse. What slows us is not malice, just natural mechanics accumulating over time, born from unconscious choices we never noticed. In a strange moment, everything in the apartment seemed to slow down, as if each object were explaining how it had shaped my life. The small table where I meant to write more but rarely sat. The windowsill where I wanted to stretch each morning but had to clear clutter before I could move. The bookshelf holding titles I intended to read but never did, simply because they were not placed where my eyes would naturally land. Every act of delay suddenly made sense, no longer an accusation against myself. I saw clearly that every small failure began with an innocent detail, a misplaced arrangement. The modern world tells us a story that strong people win by spirit, that wanting something enough and pushing hard enough can turn life around. But that is only true in speeches. In real life, where tired eyes carry nights of lost sleep, where work drains energy from dawn to dusk, where we rise from setbacks with no guide to show the way, willpower is not enough to fight the environment. Willpower is easy to drain, while the environment is patient, silent, and deeply influential. It does not act once. It acts hundreds of times a day, from every corner of the house, through every small habit we follow without thinking. And when I understood that, I felt lighter, as if a piece of guilt inside me had been washed clean. There were nights when I sat by the slightly open window, listening to the wind move through the trees outside. In that wind, I imagined something whispering that the right path is never the hardest path. The right path is the one opened, cleared, arranged so we can step onto it without stumbling over things that should not be in our way. Maybe changing our life is not about bravely fighting our instincts, but building a world around us so that our instincts want to move in that direction too. A chair placed farther away, A book placed by the bed, a pair of training shoes set exactly where the morning light falls, a phone left in another room before sleep. Small changes, like rearranging a game board where we are the players. I remember the last light of that day shining through the window, turning the room into a soft, old shade of gold, the kind of light that makes everything look like it is breathing. I touched the wooden table, the rough surface under my fingers reminding me that change is not a grand declaration, but a series of tiny shifts within reach. When we move even one small detail, the brain follows, because it always chooses what is closest, clearest, and easiest. And when we make the right choices, the easiest choices, life begins to change without requiring a silent daily battle. As I walked through the living room, I noticed the heaviness inside me had settled. Not because I had become someone new, but because I understood I no longer had to rely on an invisible force to change. I only needed to rearrange my small world so it could whisper to me that the right path is always there, waiting for the first step. And in the quiet of the night, I knew that understanding this was the first doorway to a gentler life. A life where we no longer condemn ourselves each time we fall, but simply adjust with care the way the world around us is living. In the days when I began to see more clearly how the small world around me shaped my every movement, I noticed something strange I had never seen before. Life is woven not from grand decisions, but from motions so small they are almost invisible. One morning, while holding my toothbrush, I realized I had repeated that action for years without ever asking myself whether I should do it. The same was true every afternoon when I turned on the kettle, every night when I pulled the curtains closed, and the next morning when my hand opened them again to let the light in like an old ritual. No one ordered me to do these things. No great force of will guided them, only a chain of small loops, carved so deeply into my body that they unfolded like breath. And when I thought of that, I felt a thin light flicker beneath the fog of procrastination. If the old loops could become instinct, could I create new ones? The question followed me all day like the whisper of a friend walking beside me who did not want to interrupt. I began to notice the invisible links between actions. Each time I made coffee in the morning, I realized I always leaned gently against the counter, quietly waiting for the water to drip. In that moment, my body settled, and my mind opened a small space, just enough to slip something else into it, something light, because anything too big would make the brain resist. I tried placing a notebook next to the kettle, and while waiting, I wrote a few lines. Just a few, sometimes only a single sentence, but something strange happened. After a few days of repeating it, my body seemed to reach for the notebook on its own right after I set the kettle on the stove, as if the new action had found a seat next to the old one. No effort, no force. It simply clicked into place. I remember that evening, walking through the neighborhood, the walls still carrying the faint warmth of the sun, and the wind carrying the distant echo of a basketball bouncing on the school court. In that space, I understood that true change does not need to be dramatic. It only needs to attach itself to something that already exists, like climbing a ladder where each rung is connected to another, and we do not need to leap too far to rise to a new height. New habits, if standing alone, are too heavy to lift. But when tied to old habits, like a thread tied to one already pulled tight, they can overcome the natural inertia of the body. But that can only happen if I'm not greedy. The brain does not enjoy large demands. It likes small movements that last only a few seconds. So I made new habits short enough to be impossible to refuse. 2 minutes of journaling, one stretch while standing at the sink, one deep breath when stepping through the front door. All of them linked to something familiar, like tiny stones placed next to one another to form a long path. Slowly, the seeds of change began to take root. And though I did not want to admit it, a quiet joy rose in me when I realized I had done something I once believed I could not. Not because it was great, but because it was smooth. It no longer required a morning battle of choices. It no longer waited for a decision. My body chose for me. It felt like, for the first time in my life, I was speaking a language my brain understood. One rainy afternoon, I sat in the living room listening to drops fall onto the roof, carrying the steady rhythm of a sad but gentle song. Rain often makes it easier for me to think, as if all unnecessary motions fade, leaving only a calm inner space. I began to understand that what makes us fail is not weak desire, but expecting ourselves to do too much, too soon, too fast. A habit that lasts 30 minutes makes the brain want to run, but a 2-minute habit makes it curious. And once it begins, it wants to continue. Because movement itself brings a quiet pleasure, like the feeling of feet gliding across pavement after days without running. When I shared this with a friend, she looked at me with a mix of doubt and delight, as if I had revealed an old secret everyone once brushed against but never kept. I told her that change is not climbing a mountain, it is stepping onto a small stone. The problem is that we look at the mountain and panic, forgetting that the first stone is only a few steps away. Small actions repeated over and over accumulate, like raindrops gathering into a pool. And one day we realize we have gone farther than expected. Not because of big steps, but because we did not stop. I noticed I had begun living with a lightness I once believed was impossible. The habits stitched together like broken pieces of pottery repaired with gold. They were not perfect, but they formed a new shape, and that shape grew stronger each day. That night, as I closed my notebook after a few short lines, I looked at the page and felt something inside me open quietly. I thought that if someone were listening to this story, perhaps they had once stood exactly where I stood, facing unfinished efforts. And if you feel something familiar in this journey, you can leave a few lines. A small sign that we are not walking alone. The thoughts you write may become support for someone else or for you on a softer day. And if you want to keep walking with me into deeper stories, follow the channel, not to add noise, but to have a slow place to return to. In the silence of that night, I saw more clearly than ever that we do not need to become someone else right away. We only need to find a familiar rhythm and gently tie a new rhythm to it. And little by little, life begins to shift in a direction that no longer pushes against us. There are evenings when I sit alone in a quiet room, only the slow turning of the ceiling fan and the warm yellow light settling like soft dust over everything. In that moment, when nothing is hiding anything anymore, I realize that procrastination does not wear the face of laziness the way we often believe. It is like a thin mist resting on a glass surface, light enough for us to think we can wipe it away at any time. Yet day after day, we let it gather until we can no longer see our own reflection behind it. I have sat many times staring at an unfinished book, at a document waiting to be completed, feeling only a weight like stone in my chest that stopped my hand before I could write the final sentence. I did not understand why something so simple could freeze me. Only when I watched closely did I see that the brain is not avoiding the work. It is avoiding the heavy feeling we have tied to that work. There are days when I open my laptop and feel only fog. The task is too big, too long, too unclear at the beginning, making every cell in my body want to step back. The brain chooses the easier path, checking a few messages, scrolling the home page, watching a short video, and convincing itself that in a few minutes it will return. But those few minutes stretch into an hour, then 2, then the entire afternoon slips away without leaving a trace. Each time that happens, I feel a small wave of self-blame, as if I'm losing myself. But the more I blame, the less I begin. And in that loop, I see clearly that procrastination is not a deliberate act, but a quiet plea from the brain to avoid the sting of failure before it arrives. One afternoon, under the ashy gray light of an approaching rain, I walked to my desk and saw the scattered papers lying like the remnants of efforts that never reached the finish line. Each sheet felt like a cliff I had to climb, and that image alone exhausted me before I even touched the work. Standing there, I suddenly understood that what stops us is not the work itself, but the giant shape we project onto it. All it needed was to be made smaller, easier to touch, and everything would change. I tried something simple, cleaning my desk for 10 minutes. When the surface became clear, the work felt lighter too, as if I had wiped away an invisible layer of dust from my mind. Then I opened the document, but read only 3 lines, no more. And in those 3 lines, something strange happened again. I felt I could read 3 more, and 3 more after that. The brain does not resist when it faces only a small piece of the mountain. It rebels only when we force it to climb all of it at once. Another time, I sat by the window with a cup of mint tea still steaming. The scent drifted through the air, making the room feel open, as if a narrow passage had been cleared. I realized that placing a small ritual before each task created a sense of ease, like setting a soft rug underfoot before stepping into a cold room. When an action becomes even slightly appealing, the brain no longer sees it as a threat. It moves closer, with less resistance, and when I finish, If I give myself a tiny reward, even something as simple as marking a small box on a whiteboard, a gentle satisfaction spreads through my chest like an exhale after a steep climb. The brain only needs to know that its effort is seen, not swallowed by all of life's demands. Day by day, I began to see something. Whenever I procrastinated, it was not a sign that I did not want to do the work, but a sign that I had not prepared enough to want to begin. Like a door stuck at the hinge, the harder we pull, the less it moves. Just one drop of oil, and everything glides so smoothly we wonder why we suffered for so long before. One evening, I opened a drawer to take out a stack of sticky notes to write down a few tasks for the next day. But when I opened it, I saw crumpled pieces filled with hurried, chaotic handwriting. A bit of my own disorder lived there. I decided to throw everything away and start with a single sheet. Strangely, reducing everything to one point made the brain feel safer. I wrote one action, simple like drinking a glass of water when waking up. Looking at it, I felt a clarity I had not felt in a long time. The fog vanished. And in that moment, I understood that what stops us is not laziness, but not knowing where to begin. Once the first step is lit, the path behind it slowly appears. Sometimes, I look back at the years when I tied my self-worth to my ability to resist procrastination. Each failure made me shrink like a wounded animal. But now, understanding the hidden structure behind every delay, I feel softer inside. No more anger, no more accusations, only the awareness that the brain is trying to protect me in the only way it knows. Even if the method is flawed, it does not want me overwhelmed. It does not want me facing the fear of failure. It does not want me drained. And when I learn to make everything clearer, more inviting, easier to start and easier to finish, the brain stops treating work as danger. It becomes calm, gentle, and I do too. On late afternoons when the last light spills across the floor in a pale orange band, I often sit for a few minutes to feel the small shifts within myself. Not regret, not grand hope, just the realization that change happens not when we defeat procrastination, but when we understand it deeply enough to lead it with us. Procrastination is not the enemy. It is the child within us, afraid of the dark, needing a little light to step into a new room. And since understanding that, I know that every small action, every careful bit of preparation, every moment of making the path just a little lighter, is a gentle reassurance to the deepest part of myself, that this is not frightening, that I can begin, that one small rhythm is enough to guide the whole day in a different direction. I once believed that to maintain discipline, we had to wait for some kind of inspiration to flare up, like a sudden flame lighting the dark corners inside us and pushing us to rise and change. But after many days observing myself in the slower rhythms of life, I realized inspiration is as fragile as morning mist on the grass, beautiful but too quick to disappear to hold on to anything. There are mornings when I wake with an empty heart, as if someone has taken from me the strength I was certain I possessed the night before. I look at the running shoes placed by the door, silent like two old reminders, and I wonder why they cannot lift me up for even a few minutes. Then I realize the shoes are not wrong. I am not wrong. I simply placed the wrong expectations on emotion. Emotion was never meant to be a motor. It is only a passing breeze, sometimes gentle, sometimes strong, but never steady enough to entrust an entire life to it. One early autumn morning, when the ground was still damp from night rain, I woke in a pale light that softened everything as if the world were wrapped in an unfinished dream. I did not want to leave the bed. All the promises I had made to myself the night before felt distant, like a church bell echoing from a neighboring town. But then I remembered that last night I had placed my workout clothes right next to the bed. When my hand touched the cold fabric, something strange happened. My body moved before my mind could resist. I sat up without understanding how. In that moment, I understood that things prepared ahead of time, even the smallest ones, hold more power than any burst of inspiration. They act like a hand placed gently on the back, not pushing hard, just reminding us that the thing we need to do is already here, already waiting for us to step into it. In the days that followed, I tried something else, placing my alarm clock far enough that I had to stand up to turn it off. Its sound echoed through the quiet room like a pebble skimming across a lake, and my body had no choice but to respond. A tiny action that pulled the entire day in a new direction. When I stood up, my clothes were ready, My shoes were ready, my morning playlist already set to begin the moment I entered the living room. It was not that I wanted to run, it was that the system I built made not running harder than running. In those moments, I saw clearly a truth I had forgotten for years. Action does not need to be loved to happen, it only needs to be prepared well. I remember a cold morning, droplets of dew clinging to the balcony rail. I stepped outside, tied my shoelaces, and heard the tightening of the knot like the sound of a decision that would not be taken back. In that instant, I did not feel excitement or motivation, only a quiet acceptance that I would do what I had prepared myself to do, and strangely, that calmness brought more comfort than any rush of inspiration. When my feet touched the road, my steps echoed evenly, like my heartbeat syncing with a world I once believed I did not belong to. The more I ran, the warmer my body became, and in that movement, I realized that sometimes inspiration does not precede action, it is born from action. On a windy winter afternoon, I sat in a small corner cafe watching people hurry through their own lives. Warm light fell over the wooden table like glaze over pottery. I wrote a simple sentence in my notebook. Discipline is what happens before we have time to think. I realized I was not as afraid of hard things as I thought. What I feared was the moment of choosing. But if that moment is designed so that the right choice becomes the easiest choice, the brain no longer needs a reason to agree. It simply follows momentum. And that momentum, if repeated enough times, becomes part of who we are. I applied this to other parts of my life, not just running. When I wanted to read more, I placed the book on the table next to the sofa where my hand would reach it before reaching for the remote. When I wanted to drink less coffee, I placed the kettle and tea where they were easier to grab. When I wanted to write, I kept the document open on my laptop. Each small change was a subtle negotiation between the rational and instinctive parts of me, like two people sharing a body finally finding an agreement they could both live with. And on days like that, I felt a gentle flow in my life, like a small stream gliding over stones arranged just right so the water would not stumble. Sometimes, when I look back on the road I have walked, I realize I no longer seek strong bursts of inspiration. They are too flashy, too fickle, too far from the rhythm of real life. What I want is a steady foundation, a soft structure holding me on the days when my spirit sinks, a staircase with even steps, a path that is not too steep, a tender reminder that even when my heart does not want to move, my feet still know where to go. Walking home on a late winter evening, the wind cutting cold across my face, I understood that we do not need to love waking early, or love exercising, or love writing or studying every day. These things may still be heavy, tiring, demanding, but if they become inevitable, prepared the night before, supported by the world around us rather than resisted by it, then they become a natural part of life. And perhaps most importantly, this change does not require us to transform into someone unfamiliar. It only asks that we tend to the small details the way a gardener tends each branch. It is not grand changes that create stability, but the repetition of small ones, repeated until we no longer notice how far they have taken us. On the long road, it is the small things that save us. There was a long winter evening when I sat in a room lit only by a small desk lamp shining onto the wooden surface, revealing each grain like layers of memory stacked together. I felt a silence spreading in my chest. Not a frightening silence, but a gentle one, as if I were standing before a doorway that opened into something deeper than myself. Through all the months of experimenting with new habits, trying preparation, trying to shrink actions, trying to attach them to old loops, I realized something strange. The greatest change was not in what I did, but in how I saw myself in every small movement. Each time I completed a small action, a page written, a short run, a tidied corner of my desk, I felt as if someone inside me nodded quietly. A gesture almost invisible, yet enough for me to understand that I was laying another stone into the foundation of the person I wanted to become. For so long I had lived with the belief that I was someone who lacked discipline, as if a suspended verdict hung over me, waiting for a single misstep to prove itself true. I once believed my worth was tied to my ability to overcome procrastination, as if every small failure was evidence that I did not deserve the path I wished to walk. But the deeper I stepped into this journey, the more I realized that was untrue. An action is not a declaration of ability, it is a signal of identity. And identity can always shift if we know how to lay the right first bricks. One afternoon, I stood before the mirror in my bedroom. a mirror slightly dull from months of clinging moisture. The light from the hallway spilled in just enough for me to see my faint reflection, a sketch not quite finished. I suddenly understood that I had lived too long inside that sketch, believing it was complete, when in truth I had never allowed myself to redraw it. When I ran for 2 minutes, when I wrote a small paragraph, when I arranged my room, I was not just performing an action, I was adding a new stroke to the outline of who I was becoming. Each small stroke shifted the frame, and one day I looked again and no longer recognized the old drawing. It did not happen with drums or fireworks. It happened in the quiet of ordinary evenings, where I learned to breathe evenly and accept that I was becoming someone new without needing to announce it. I began to see clearly that identity is not something we proclaim. It is something we accumulate. If each day we repeat a small action for even a few minutes, we are casting a vote for our future self. One vote does not decide the outcome, but hundreds of votes shape the form we will grow into. That realization brought me a rare kind of peace. Peace because I no longer had to be certain that I would change my whole life. I only needed to be certain that today I would cast one vote in the right direction, and that I knew I could do. There was a time I sat in a small cafe where the lights reflected on the table in thin, glowing streaks. I looked around and saw strangers passing through one another's lives without ever knowing what battles the others were fighting. An older man in the far corner held an old book, but his eyes were drifting. A young woman at the window played with her spoon as if weighing a thought she could not yet speak. I wondered if they had ever felt lost within themselves the way I once had. Then I thought of what I had just learned, that feeling lost is not a mistake, but a sign that we are standing between two versions of ourselves, the familiar version behind us and the new one waiting ahead, asking only for small and steady steps. In that moment, I felt like I was sitting beside a slow-moving river. Small leaves drifted past, each one like a day of my life carrying its own weight. Each leaf I dropped into the water was an action, a decision, a choice. And over time, the river would shift its direction because it always follows what is placed into it. Identity works the same way. It does not change when we redraw it with grand gestures, but when we gently guide its flow with movements so small they go unnoticed, yet accumulate with quiet power. That evening, when I returned home, I turned on a small lamp in the living room. The warm yellow light filled the space, wrapping me in something familiar yet new in its own soft way. I sat down, placed my hand on the open page before me, and in that moment I felt a sense of completeness unlike anything I once called success. Not because I had done anything remarkable, but because I realized that each small action I had taken was proving something deeper, that I had begun to believe in myself, not believing I was strong, but believing I could become strong, not believing I was capable, but believing I had the ability to nurture the capable version of myself day by day. As that thought settled into me, I understood that lasting change comes only when we stop acting to prove something to the world and start acting to reinforce something inside. When we stop defending the old version of who we were and begin living from the new version quietly taking shape, life is no longer a battle but a turning of seasons. Each small action is like a leaf changing color, signaling that a new season is arriving. I looked around the room and felt everything speaking to me in its own way. The wooden desk where I had learned to rewrite my life one sentence at a time, the shoes by the door like a heartbeat urging me forward, the mirror in the bedroom reflecting a figure that was no longer the same. And for the first time, I felt I was no longer being pulled back into the past, not because the past had vanished, but because I had placed enough new stones beneath my feet to stop slipping from the path ahead. When I turned off the light before bed, I understood something I had never been calm enough to see. Actions do not create identity. Repeated actions do. And when identity shifts, every habit, every choice, every movement in life shifts with it, as gently as a river finding a new path without making a sound. There was one morning I remember clearly, not because anything remarkable happened, but because it opened in me a feeling as if I had stepped into another world, lighter, wider, and kind in a way I had never known. The first light of day slipped through the window, not bright and golden, but soft like a comfort that had waited a long time to be spoken. I stood up, my feet touching the cold wooden floor, and I realized something inside me had quietly shifted. The urgency was gone. The need to prove anything to anyone, even to myself, had dissolved. In that moment, I heard only my own breath, steady and peaceful like a small river running through a silent valley. I made a cup of hot tea, the steam rising like a thin veil of dream, and suddenly realized I was no longer thinking about unfinished tasks, no longer listing old failures, no longer aching over the times I had fallen short. All the voices that once sat heavy in my mind had gone quiet, as if they were tired, or perhaps because they no longer had anything to cling to. I was no longer standing on a battlefield. I had stepped away from it, moved into a place where I no longer needed to raise any shield or brace myself. Freedom had not come from winning. It came from understanding that the battle never needed to happen. I remember stepping onto the balcony, looking down at a street still half asleep. A man walked his small dog. A delivery truck rolled slowly through the narrow road. A few children rode their bikes past, their laughter rising then fading into the air. Everyone moved at their own rhythm, not faster or slower because of anyone else, and I understood that comparison had once been the largest shadow in my life. For years I lived as if I were racing someone, when no one had ever stood at the starting line across from me. All those races, I built them myself, believing only achievement could prove I was enough, only perfect discipline could prove I was worthy. But now, looking at the peaceful street, I saw the only thing I needed was to live in my own rhythm. Not too fast, not too slow, untouched by the imagined eyes that once followed me everywhere. In the days that followed, I began to feel a deeper kind of freedom, the kind that comes not from trying to become my ideal self, but simply becoming my true self, a little at a time. I no longer saw the habits I was building as proof of my worth, but as natural movements. I ran not to become a great runner, but because my body found its calm in motion. I wrote not to showcase ability, but to hear the sound of pen on paper, to watch tangled thoughts soften into words. I woke early not to impress anyone, but to walk inside the first stretch of morning light, when the world is still soft and forgiving. One afternoon, sitting by a window cracked open, the wind carrying the scent of old trees from the street, I looked back at my journey and for the first time felt no heaviness. Every fall had its reason. Every delay carried a message that I had not yet understood myself well enough, not yet arranged my small world to support me instead of stopping me. When I understood that, I no longer blamed myself. I felt like someone who had stepped out of a dark room after many years, entering the light not with fear but with gratitude that it was still possible to live differently. I imagined myself standing by the edge of a wide lake. The water was so still it reflected every detail above it, but what held me there was not my reflection. It was the lightness in my chest, a lightness I once thought could not be real. I no longer felt the need to prove, to be correct, to do something grand enough to erase old mistakes. I only needed to move forward with the calm of someone learning to live again. And when I dipped my toes into the water, the ripples spread outward like proof that every small movement has an echo. Every action I had taken in this journey, no matter how tiny, had spread through my life in ways I could not see immediately. They changed me from the inside, the way wind changes the surface of a lake without making a sound. And I knew that from that day on, I no longer needed to run away from myself. I had found my rhythm, my flow, my place. When I walked back inside and closed the balcony door, the room felt a little larger. Not because anything had changed in it, but because I had changed. My mind was no longer crowded with accusing whispers, no longer heavy with the judgments I used to place on my own shoulders. I felt like a new person, not perfect, not free of every scar, but free. A freedom not born from escaping the world, but from realizing the world no longer had the right to define me the way it once did. I no longer needed to be someone else, no longer needed to please anyone, no longer needed to prove anything. I only needed to keep walking, light and steady, on the path I had been quietly clearing for myself each day. That night, when I turned off the lights, I stood for a moment in the darkness, feeling peace radiate gently from within my own body. A peace, not loud, not promising anything, not pretending anything, simply the quiet acceptance that I was beginning again in a way that was truer, simpler, and kinder to myself, and I knew that whatever tomorrow held, I had the inner strength to continue, not through force, but through the steady rhythm of someone who had finally found their real pace. I spoke softly into the darkness, as if speaking to the person I was becoming. You are stronger when you stop trying to prove it.
Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this story. If this message touched your heart, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you'll never miss the next journey we take together. Your support means the world to me.